The hall was built for glory. Cathedral ceilings arched overhead, carved from black stone veined with gold, catching the light of 1,000 candles. Their flames flickered like restless spirits, reflecting off polished floors where power had walked for centuries. Every pillar told a story. Every shadow held a secret. And tonight, every eye was watching. They had gathered from across the territories, alphas, betas, council elders, heirs to bloodlines older than memory. Silk and steel, perfume and power. The air itself felt heavy with expectation. Because this wasn't just a ceremony. This was a claiming, a mating rite, and at the center of it all stood her. She didn't move, didn't dare. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers trembling just enough to betray the storm beneath her calm. The ceremonial gown clung softly to her frame, silver-threaded, luminous in the candlelight. It had been made for this moment. Every stitch a promise, every fold a future. She could feel them staring, judging, measuring. But none of that mattered, because he was here, the Alpha King. He stood opposite her, unmoving, unreadable, carved from authority itself. Dark attire edged in gold. Broad shoulders squared like a man who had never once questioned his place in the world. Or anyone else's. This was how it was meant to be. The bond had chosen. Fate had aligned. And, in just moments, it would be sealed. Forever. A low chant echoed through the chamber. Ancient words spoken by the high priest, his voice steady, rhythmic, pulling the room into something older than power, something sacred. The air shifted, tightened. Her heartbeat slowed, then raced. She could feel it, the pull, the connection, that invisible thread tying her to him. It had been there from the moment their eyes met days ago. Quiet, unyielding, real. Everything she had been told since childhood led here. You don't question the bond. You don't doubt fate. You don't walk away. Her gaze lifted just slightly and met his. For a second, just one. Something flickered. Not warmth. Not recognition. Something else. Something colder. The priest's voice rose. Before the witnesses of the 5 territories, before the bloodlines and the laws that bind us, we ask. Silence pressed in. The moment. The decision. All eyes turned to him. The Alpha King stepped forward. One step. Measured. Controlled. Every movement deliberate. Her breath caught. This was it. This was the moment her life changed. He stopped in front of her. Close enough now that she could see every detail. The sharp line of his jaw, the stillness in his expression, the absence of hesitation. Too still. Too calm. Something was wrong. The bond inside her shifted. A flicker of unease. Then, he stepped back. Not forward. Back. The movement was subtle. But in a room like this, it was deafening. The chant faltered. The priest stopped mid-word. A ripple moved through the crowd, barely a sound, but unmistakable. Confusion. Her stomach dropped. No. No, that wasn't. He shouldn't. He wasn't supposed to. Her lips parted slightly, breath shallow now, chest tightening as something invisible began to strain between them. The bond. It pulled. Stretched. Her pulse spiked. Your Majesty. The priest began carefully, uncertainty threading into his voice. The Alpha King didn't look at him. He didn't look at anyone. He looked at her. Straight through her. And in that gaze, there was no warmth. No hesitation. Only decision. Final. Absolute. I reject you. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed. Heavy. Cold. Irreversible. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world didn't shatter. The hall didn't erupt. The candles didn't flicker. Everything stayed exactly the same. Except her. Because inside her, something broke. A sharp, invisible tear ripped through her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. Her fingers twitched, then clenched, as if she could physically hold the bond together, force it not to slip away. But it was already happening. She felt it. That thread, once warm, steady, alive. Snapping. A gasp tore from somewhere in the crowd. Another. Then whispers. Low. Sharp. Spreading. What? He rejected? In the right? No Alpha has ever. Her knees weakened, just slightly, enough that she had to fight to stay standing. Don't fall. Not here. Not in front of them. Her vision blurred, not from tears, not yet, but from the sudden, crushing weight pressing down on her chest. The world tilted, just a fraction. He didn't move, didn't reach for her, didn't even flinch. Like this was expected. Like this was nothing. The priest tried again, voice strained now. Your Majesty, this is a sacred. I'm aware of what it is. Calm. Flat. Controlled. The interruption cut clean through the rising tension. And then silence returned. But this time, it wasn't sacred. It was suffocating. She swallowed, forcing air into lungs that refused to cooperate. Say something. Ask him why. Demand. But no words came. Because somewhere deep inside, she already knew. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't hesitation. This was a choice. And he had already made it. The whispers grew louder now, less restrained, more curious, more cruel. Eyes that had once watched with admiration now shifted, calculating, distant, entertained. She could feel it, the shift, from chosen to discarded. Her fingers trembled again, this time uncontrollably. Still, she stood. Still, she faced him. Still, she waited. For anything. A reason. An explanation. A single crack in that perfect, impenetrable control. But there was nothing. Only silence. Only distance. Only the space he had created. When he stepped away and refused to close it, the bond gave one last fragile pull. Then, gone. The absence was worse than the pain. It was hollow. Empty. Like something vital had been carved out of her, and the world expected her to remain whole. A soft, broken sound escaped her lips before she could stop it. Not loud. Not dramatic. But in a room this quiet, it might as well have been a scream. He heard it. Of course he did. But he didn't react. Didn't soften. Didn't regret. He simply turned. One smooth movement. Already done. Already moving on. As if she had never mattered. As if this moment, this destruction, was nothing more than a minor correction. Behind him, the hall began to breathe again. Voices rising. Speculation spreading. Power shifting in real time. But she remained where she stood. Alone. Unclaimed. Unwanted. Under the weight of 1,000 watching eyes. And somewhere, beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation, beneath the silence crushing her from all sides, a single question burned. Not loud. Not yet. But growing. Why? Why would the most powerful alpha in the territories reject her? Here. Like this. In front of everyone. And why? Did it feel like this was only the beginning? The silence didn't break. It spread. Slowly, deliberately, like ink bleeding into water. No one moved at first. No one dared. Because what had just happened, what they had just witnessed, didn't belong in tradition. It didn't belong in law. It didn't belong in a world where bonds were sacred and fate was absolute. And yet, it had happened. Right in front of them. Her name was Lyra Ashwin. And in the span of a single breath, she had gone from chosen to erased. Lyra had not been born into power. She had not been raised among silk or strategy, nor trained to navigate the delicate games of politics that ruled the upper ranks of the territories. Her world had been smaller, quieter, harder. She came from the Ashwin line, a name that once carried weight before it fell. Before alliances broke. Before whispers turned into distance. Before her pack became something others tolerated, but never respected. The golden hall flickers, replaced by a much smaller place. A worn cottage. Smoke curling from a crooked chimney. The scent of pine and ash. A younger Lyra, barefoot on cold floors, watching her mother scrub stains from fabric that didn't belong to them. Her mother used to say it like a promise. You don't need power, Lyra. Not if the bond chooses you. A quiet belief. A fragile hope. Because in their world, the bond was everything. It didn't care about status. Didn't follow politics. Didn't bend to power. It chose. And when it did, even kings answered. Back to the hall.
Back to now.
Back to the moment that shattered that belief into something unrecognizable. Lyra stood exactly where she had been left, breathing.
Barely.
Her fingers curled slowly into her palms, nails pressing into skin, as if grounding herself could stop the collapse happening inside her. But it didn't, because now the whispers weren't quiet anymore. They said she was from Ashwin. That explains it. The king would never. He must have seen something, or realized something. Each word landed like a blade. Small.
Precise.
Accumulating. She didn't look at them. She couldn't, because if she did, if she let herself see the shift in their faces, the curiosity replacing admiration, the judgment replacing anticipation, she might break completely. And he still hadn't moved. He stood with the same stillness he had held from the beginning, unshaken, untouched, as if nothing in this moment had cost him anything. This was who he had always been. Valdric Thornhall, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. A man who did not rise to power by chance or fate or kindness.
He built it,
Controlled it. Secured it.
piece by piece.
He did not trust fate. He did not rely on emotion. And he did not allow anything or anyone to exist beyond his control. Not even a bond. Lyra's chest tightened again. Because now she understood. Not fully. Not completely. But enough. This wasn't hesitation. This wasn't confusion. This was calculation. The priest cleared his throat, attempting to restore order. This cannot proceed without. It won't proceed. Valdric's voice cut through the space cleanly. Controlled. Decisive. Final. A ripple moved through the crowd again. More restless this time. More alive. Because now they were no longer witnessing something uncertain. They were watching something intentional. Lyra finally spoke. Her voice barely there. Why? It wasn't loud. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't even steady. But it carried. Because the entire hall was listening. Valdric looked at her again. And this time, he didn't look through her. He looked at her. Measured. Evaluating. Like a decision already made, being explained for the sake of clarity. You want a reason. Not a question. A statement. Lyra swallowed. Nodded once. The pause that followed stretched longer than it should have. Long enough for hope to flicker. Just slightly. Long enough for her to wonder. Maybe there was something she didn't know. Something that could still. You are not suited for this position. The words landed flat.
Precise.
Almost clinical. The hope died instantly. My position? Her voice cracked, barely audible now. Queen. One word. Heavy. Final. Another ripple. Louder this time. Because now the rejection had context. And context made it worse. Valdric continued. Unhurried. Unapologetic. As Alpha King, every decision I make shapes the stability of 5 territories. Every alliance, every perception, every weakness is measured. His gaze never left her. And you. A pause. Not for emotion. For emphasis. Are a liability. The word hit harder than the rejection itself. Lyra's breath caught. Her body stilled.
Completely.
You come from a fractured pack. Your bloodline carries no influence. No leverage. No strength that benefits the throne. Each sentence was delivered the same way. Even. Controlled. Unfeeling. You offer no political advantage. A murmur of agreement rippled faintly through parts of the crowd. And more importantly, another pause. Longer this time. Calculated. You are unpredictable. Lyra's brows knit slightly. Confusion flickering through the shock. I don't. A bond, he interrupted smoothly, removes control. His tone didn't change, but something in it sharpened. Almost imperceptibly. And I do not allow anything to compromise my control. There it was. The truth. Not softened. Not hidden. Not disguised as necessity. He didn't reject her because she wasn't enough. He rejected her because the bond made her too powerful in a way he couldn't command. The realization hit. Too late. Because the bond, already strained, now reacted. It tore. Not cleanly. Not instantly, but violently. Lyra gasped, her hand flying to her chest as something inside her pulled, hard enough to make her knees buckle. A sound escaped her.
Sharp.
Uncontrolled. The crowd reacted immediately.
Gasps.
Movement. Shock rippling outward in waves. She's the bond. It's tearing. Her vision blurred. The room tilted. The candlelight fractured into streaks of gold and shadow. No. The words slipped out of her without permission. A plea. Not to him. To the bond. To fate. To anything that would listen. But nothing did. Valdrick didn't move. Didn't step forward. Didn't reach out. He watched. The thread snapped. Silence. Absolute. Total. Then, Lyra collapsed. Not gracefully. Not slowly. But completely. Her knees hit the polished floor first.
Hard.
The impact echoing louder than it should have in a room this full. Her hands followed, catching herself just barely before her body gave out entirely. A few wolves stepped forward instinctively, then stopped. Because he hadn't. Valdrick stood exactly where he was, looking down at her, expression unchanged. This was the moment everything shifted. Not when he rejected her, not when he spoke, but now, when she fell, and he chose not to catch her. Because in a world where bonds were sacred, where mates were protected above all else, where even enemies respected the connection fate created, he did nothing. The whispers changed. Not confusion anymore. Not curiosity. Something else. Understanding. He really meant it. He severed it completely. She's nothing now. Lyra's breath came in uneven pulls. Her chest felt hollow.
Wrong.
Like something vital had been ripped out and left an empty space behind. She tried to stand.
Failed.
Her arms trembled beneath her weight. No one moved to help her. Not the priest. Not the elders. Not the witnesses. And not him. Valdrick turned. Just like that. No hesitation. No second glance. No regret. Already walking away. Leaving her behind. On the floor. Where the entire world could see exactly what she had become. Unclaimed. Unprotected. Rejected. And as the doors of the great hall began to open behind him, as the ceremony dissolved into chaos and whispers, as Lyra remained on her knees in the center of it all, one truth settled in, cold and absolute. This wasn't just humiliation. This wasn't just loss. This was something worse. Because now, she didn't just have nothing. She had nowhere to go. And no one was coming to help her. The doors closed behind him. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a soft, final sound. Wood meeting stone. And somehow, that was worse. Because it marked the end. Not of the ceremony. Not of the moment. But of her place in it. The hall didn't erupt into chaos. It dissolved.
Slowly.
Groups forming. Voices lowering, glances shifting. The center of the room, where Lyra still knelt, became something to avoid. Not out of respect, but discomfort. She could feel it, even without looking. The way the space around her emptied. The way footsteps curved, subtly, deliberately, to go around her instead of through. As if she had become something fragile. Or worse, contagious. Lyra's hands pressed flat against the cold floor. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, not entirely, but from something deeper. A violent, internal wrongness she didn't have words for. The bond was gone, but her body hadn't caught up yet. It still reached for something that wasn't there, still expected the warmth, the presence, the connection that had lived just beneath her skin, constant,
Quiet. Alive. Now.
nothing. A hollow space yawned inside her chest, vast and cold. And her body reacted like it had been wounded. Because it had. Her breath came shallow, uneven. Each inhale sharp enough to sting. Her pulse raced, then stuttered, then raced again, like it didn't know how to function without the rhythm it had always followed. Get up. The voice didn't come from outside. It came from her. Get up. But her limbs didn't respond. Not properly. The priest moved first. Not toward her.
Away.
The ceremony is concluded, he announced, voice strained but controlled, already trying to restore order to something that no longer existed. Clear the hall. Clear the hall. Lyra blinked slowly. The words took a moment to settle, to make sense. Clear the hall. Not help her. Not assist her. Not even acknowledge her. Remove her. Footsteps began again. This time more decisive. More purposeful. The audience didn't linger anymore. They left. Silk brushing against stone. Boots striking polished floors. Muted conversations drifting as they moved toward the exit. No one stopped. No one knelt. No one reached out. A few looked at her. Briefly. Quick glances. The kind people give something they don't want to understand. One woman paused. Just for a second. Their eyes met. There was pity there. Faint. Careful. Then she looked away. And kept walking. Lyra's chest tightened again. Not from pain this time. From something else. Something sharper. Recognition. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something that would be corrected with explanation or time. This was permanent. I was chosen. The thought formed slowly. Broken. Her fingers curled slightly against the floor. And then, her throat tightened. Erased. The words settled into her like truth. Cold. Absolute. In a world where identity was tied to bond, where worth was reinforced by connection, where belonging was defined by who chose you to be rejected, was to become nothing. The last of the hall emptied. The doors remained open now. Cold air slipping in from the outside, carrying with it the scent of rain and distant earth. No one told her to leave. No one guided her out. They didn't need to. She was no longer part of this place. Slowly, carefully, Lyra shifted her weight. Her arms shook as she pushed against the floor. Her body resisted, not because it couldn't move, but because it didn't understand why it should. Move for what? Stand for who? There was no answer. Still, she forced it. One knee lifted, then the other. Her balance wavered, the room tilting again as dizziness swept through her vision. For a second, she thought she might fall again. But she didn't. Barely. She stood. And no one saw. The night outside was colder than it should have been. Rain had fallen earlier. The stone steps leading from the great hall were still slick, reflecting torchlight in fractured, trembling patterns. Lyra stepped out slowly, each movement deliberate, measured, as if the world might shatter again if she moved too quickly. The air hit her skin, cold, sharp, real. It should have grounded her. It didn't, because inside, everything still felt distant, muted. The guards stood at their posts, exactly where they always did, unmoving, watchful. She passed between them, close enough that she could see the detail in their armor, the slight tension in their stance. They saw her. Of course they did. But they didn't react. No bow. No acknowledgement. No recognition. Nothing. As if she were invisible. Or worse, as if she had never existed at all. Her steps slowed. Just slightly. Not because she expected them to stop her, but because part of her, a small, stubborn part, still hoped that someone would say something. Lyra, wait. This isn't. Nothing came. She kept walking. Further down the steps. Away from the hall. Away from the light. The torches grew dimmer behind her. The noise faded. The world narrowed. A group of wolves stood off to the side. Nobles. Recognizable. People who had spoken to her earlier. Smiled at her. Congratulated her. Their voices lowered as she approached. That's her? I didn't think he'd actually. In front of everyone, one of them met her eyes. For a brief moment. Then looked away. Conversation resumed. Without her. Around her. As if she were already part of the past. Lyra's chest tightened again. But this time, no tears came. Because something inside her had gone too still. Too quiet. Emotion couldn't reach where the damage had settled. She stepped off the last stair. Onto the path beyond the palace. The ground was uneven here. Darker. Less maintained. This was where the world changed. Where the power of the hall didn't reach. Where status didn't protect. Where names didn't matter. Where she belonged now. A soft wind moved through the trees, lining the outer path. Leaves rustling, branches shifting. The sound should have been comforting, familiar. Instead, it felt distant, like everything else. Lyra stopped walking, not because she chose to, because her body did. It simply
Stopped.
She stood there, in the dark, in the quiet, in the space between what she had been and what she was now. Nothing. Her arms hung loosely at her sides, her fingers slack, her posture empty. No tension, no resistance, just absence. Time passed. She didn't know how much.
Seconds.
Minutes. Maybe longer. It didn't matter, because nothing was waiting for her anymore. No music, no movement, no voices, just her, and the quiet, and the hollow space where something vital had once lived. Then,
A sound. Faint.
behind her, Lyra didn't move immediately, didn't turn, didn't react, because for a moment, she thought she imagined it. But then, it came again. Footsteps. Slow, measured, not hurried, not hesitant, deliberate, approaching. Her breath caught, just slightly. Not from fear,
Not yet.
from something else. Uncertainty. Because no one had followed her. No one had called her back. No one had cared enough to come. Until now. The footsteps didn't stop. They drew closer, closer, until they were just behind her. Close enough that she could feel the presence. The weight of it. The awareness of someone standing where no one had stood before. Lyra's fingers twitched. For the first time since she left the hall, her body reacted. Slowly, carefully, she turned. And the darkness shifted. Because whoever had followed her into the night had not come by accident. And whatever they wanted would change everything. The darkness didn't rush her. It waited, patient, measured, as if it already knew she would turn. Lyra moved slowly, not out of caution, but because everything inside her still felt delayed, disconnected. Her body turned first, then her gaze followed, and for a moment, she saw nothing, just shadow, just the outline of trees bending slightly under the weight of the wind, just the faint glow of the palace behind her, already distant. Then, he stepped forward, not from far away, not emerging dramatically, but from a place so still, so perfectly controlled, that it felt as if he had always been there, waiting. He didn't speak immediately, didn't announce himself, didn't move closer than necessary. He simply stood,
Tall. Composed.
wrapped in darkness that didn't hide him, but seemed to belong to him. His presence was different, not loud like power, not heavy like authority,
Sharp.
contained, dangerous in a way that didn't need to prove itself. Lyra's breath hitched, just slightly, because even in her state, even through the numbness, she felt it. This man was not ordinary. Where Valdric Thornhall commanded a room, this man controlled silence. His gaze settled on her, not scanning, not judging, assessing, like he had already seen everything there was to see, and made his decision. You stayed upright longer than I expected.
His voice was low.
Even, devoid of sympathy. Lyra blinked. The words took a second to reach her, to make sense. Her voice faltered.
Dry.
Unsteady. I didn't know I was being evaluated. A faint shift in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite approval. Everyone was evaluating you. The truth in it didn't sting. Not anymore. Because the pain had already gone too deep. You just didn't realize it. Silence settled again. Lyra studied him now. More carefully. Dark hair pulled loosely back. Clothing unmarked by insignia, but tailored in a way that spoke of power without needing to declare it. And his eyes. They weren't cold. They were controlled. There was a difference. You watched, she said quietly. Not a question. He didn't deny it. I did. Another pause. And you came after. Still not a question. Also correct. Lyra's fingers curled slightly at her sides. The smallest sign that something inside her was waking again. Why? This time, it was a question. And for the first time since the hall, she needed the answer. Not for validation. Not for comfort. But because understanding meant survival. The man stepped closer. One step. Measured. Controlled. Close enough now that the shadows shifted across his face, revealing more. And somehow, that made him more dangerous. Because what happened in there? His gaze flickered briefly toward the palace behind her, then back. Wasn't just rejection. Lyra's chest tightened. It was a statement.
A beat.
And statements like that. His voice lowered slightly. Create opportunities. There it was. Not kindness. Not rescue. Strategy. Lyra inhaled slowly, her body reacting before her mind caught up. So this is about him. It's always about him. The answer came too quickly. Too easily. Like truth.
Now the shape of the moment began to change.
This wasn't chance. This wasn't coincidence. This was intention. Lyra's gaze hardened. Just slightly. The first real shift since the bond broke. And I'm what?
Her voice steadier now.
A tool. The word hung between them.
Sharp. Honest.
The man didn't flinch. Didn't deny it. You're a variable. Not softer. Not kinder. More precise. And variables, he continued, can be positioned. Lyra let out a quiet breath. Of course. Of course this was what came next. Not help. Not understanding.
Use.
Always use. She should have expected it. She almost laughed. Almost. And what makes you think I'd agree to that? The question came with more strength than she felt. But it held. He studied her again. More closely this time. Because you're still standing. The answer was immediate.
Certain.
And people who break don't stand like that. Lyra stilled. Something in his tone shifted. Just slightly. Not softer. But acknowledging. You felt it, he added. The words landed heavier than the rest. The bond tearing. Her breath caught again. Reflex. You felt it end. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. Because he already knew. And you're still here. A pause. Which means you're not done. The statement settled between them. Not comfort. Not assumption. Recognition. Lyra's fingers tightened. Because for the first time since the hall, something inside her responded. Not pain. Not emptiness. Something else. Something sharper. Come with me. The words were simple.
Direct.
But they carried weight. Lyra's gaze lifted. To where? To somewhere the king cannot reach without consequence. Her chest tightened. And why would I want that? He held her gaze. Unwavering. Because right now, a slight pause. You have nothing. The truth hit clean. No cruelty. No mockery. Just fact. And I can give you something. Another step closer. Not invading. Not forcing. Just enough to shift the balance. Power. The word lingered. Protection. Another. Position. And then,
he stopped.
Letting it settle. Letting her feel it. Letting her imagine it. Lyra swallowed. Her mind raced now. Faster than her body. Faster than her pain. Because this was something. Not what she wanted. Not what she had dreamed. But something. And what do you get? His answer didn't hesitate. You. The word was deliberate.
Not softened.
Not disguised. Lyra's breath caught again. As an ally, he added.
A beat.
And as leverage. There it was again.
Honest.
Unfiltered. No illusions. This was not rescue. This was a transaction. But in a world where she had just lost everything, a transaction was still more than nothing. Trust or survival. The choice formed slowly. Heavily. If she walked away, she returned to nothing. No pack. No protection. No identity. If she accepted, she stepped into something unknown. Controlled. Potentially dangerous. But alive. Her gaze dropped briefly. To his hand. Still at his side. Still offered. Without being extended. Waiting. Not begging. Not pushing.
Certain.
Lyra exhaled slowly. Her chest still hurt. Her body still ached. The emptiness still stretched inside her. Wide and cold. But beneath it, Something else had begun to form. Not hope, not yet, but direction. She stepped forward. Just once. Enough to close the distance. Enough to make the choice real. Her hand lifted, slowly, carefully, as if the motion itself carried weight. As if crossing that space meant leaving something behind.
It did.
Her fingers hovered for a fraction of a second. Then, she took his hand. His grip was firm.
Steady. Warm. Real.
And just like that, something shifted. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to change the direction of what came next. He didn't smile. Didn't react. Just turned. And began to walk. Pulling her with him. Not forcefully. Not gently. Decisively. Lyra didn't look back immediately. But as they moved, as the palace grew smaller behind them, as the light faded and the dark took over,
she did.
Just once. The great hall stood in the distance.
Bright.
Untouched. Unchanged. As if nothing had happened inside it. As if she had never been there at all. Her chest tightened. One last time. Then she turned away. Fully. Completely. And with that single step into the unknown, Lyra Ashwin left behind everything she had ever been. For something far more dangerous. And far more powerful. Whatever waited ahead would not just change her life. It would rewrite it. They didn't travel far. Not in distance. But in meaning. They crossed something far greater than land. Because by the time the palace lights disappeared behind them, Lyra Ashwin was no longer walking as the girl who had been rejected. She was walking toward something else. Something deliberate. Something chosen. The path narrowed as they moved deeper into the forest, the air growing colder, quieter, heavier with intent. The sounds of the outer territories faded until even the wind seemed to lower its voice. No guards. No escort. No witnesses. Just him. And her. He didn't speak for a while. Didn't explain. Didn't offer comfort. And strangely, that made it easier to follow him. Because there were no illusions here. No false promises. No fragile expectations waiting to break. Only what was real. They reached it just before the horizon shifted. A structure hidden between stone and shadow. Not grand. Not decorative. But powerful in a way that didn't need to prove itself. He stopped at the threshold. Turned slightly. Not fully facing her. This is where you decide. Lyra's gaze lifted. Her body still ached. Her chest still hollow. But her mind was awake now. Decide what? She asked quietly. He gestured toward the structure. Step inside and everything changes. A pause. You don't walk back out the same. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides. I already didn't. The answer came faster than she expected. His gaze shifted toward her. Just slightly. Acknowledging. Then you understand the cost. Another pause. Longer this time. And the gain. Lyra didn't look away. He held her gaze. Steady. Unmoving. Protection. One word. Simple. No one touches you without answering to me. A beat. Power. Another. I give you the tools to ensure no one ever puts you on your knees again. Her chest tightened, just slightly. Status. Final. You won't just exist. A pause. You'll matter. The words landed deeper than they should have. Because that was what she had lost. Not the bond. Not him. Her place. Her worth. Her identity. And in return, her voice was steadier now. His answer didn't change. Didn't soften. You help me dismantle the king. Not challenge. Not oppose. Dismantle. Lyra exhaled slowly. There it was again. Truth. Sharp. Clear. No illusions. And if I refuse? He didn't hesitate. You walk away. A beat. Alone. The word echoed longer than it should have. Because she already knew what that meant. She had just lived it. Silence settled again. Not heavy this time. Focused. Lyra stepped forward. Past him. Into the threshold. And the moment her foot crossed, something shifted. Not in the world. In her. Because for the first time since the bond broke, she made a choice. The days that followed didn't ease her pain. They sharpened it. There was no time for grief here. No space for mourning. Only structure. Only discipline. Only expectation. He didn't treat her gently. He didn't treat her like someone broken. He treated her like someone unfinished. The first time she held a blade, her hand shook. Not from fear. From unfamiliarity. Grip tighter. His voice came from behind her. She adjusted. Not like you're afraid of it. Her jaw tightened. I'm not. Then stop holding it like you are. He stepped closer. Adjusted her stance, without hesitation. Again. She moved. Slower this time. More controlled.
Missed.
Again. The word repeated. Over. And over. And over. Until her arms burned. Her breath faltered. Her body threatened to give out. Again. No sympathy. No pause. Only repetition. Only pressure. Until
She didn't miss.
just once. A small shift. But enough. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not impressed. But noting. Progress. The next lessons were quieter. More dangerous. Words matter more than weapons in a room like this. She sat across from him. Watching. Listening. Say the wrong thing. He leaned forward slightly. And you lose before the fight begins. Lyra frowned. I don't belong in rooms like that. Not yet. The correction was immediate. But you will. He slid a document across the table. Read.
She did.
And for the first time, she realized how much she didn't understand. Politics. Alliances. Hidden meanings beneath simple phrases. You're not speaking to hear yourself, he said. You're speaking to control what others believe. The idea settled slowly, then deeper. They don't need truth.
His voice was calm.
Measured. They need something that feels like truth. Lyra's gaze lifted. That sounds like a lie. It is. No hesitation. No one in power survives without them. She leaned back slightly.
Processing.
And you? A small pause. I survive. Not an answer, but enough. This part was the hardest, because it required her to confront something she wasn't ready to face. You react too quickly. I just feel too much. The interruption was quiet, but precise. Lyra stilled, because it was true. You think that's a weakness, she said. I think it's uncontrolled.
A beat.
Control it and it becomes your advantage. Her chest tightened.
How?
He held her gaze. You stop letting others see it. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces. Small shifts. Small changes. The way she stood. The way she spoke. The way she thought. Pain turned into something sharper. Anger followed. Not loud. Not explosive. Focused. Directed. Then,
Control.
learning when to speak. When to stay silent. When to let others underestimate her. And slowly, ambition. Not for power, but for something deeper. Never being that powerless again. Not everyone believed in her. Whispers followed. Even here. She won't last. She's still weak. The king broke her. She heard them. Every word. And, at first, they were right. She stumbled. Spoke too soon. Missed details. Misread intentions.
Failed.
More than once. But she didn't stop. Because stopping meant going back. And going back was no longer an option. It happened quietly. In a room that looked like any other. A gathering. Minor. Unimportant. But full of eyes. Watching. Testing. A nobleman spoke first. Smooth. Confident. You're adapting quickly, he said. Lyra inclined her head slightly. Learning. Ashwin blood learns, he smiled faintly. A test. A trap. The old Lyra would have flinched, would have defended, would have reacted. But not this time. She tilted her head slightly. Just enough. Only when it's worth learning from. Silence.
Subtle.
But immediate. The nobleman's smile faltered. Just for a second. Then returned. But it wasn't the same. Across the room, her mentor watched. Didn't smile. Didn't react. But his gaze sharpened. Because that was the first time. She didn't just survive the moment. She controlled it. And by the time the gathering ended, the whispers had changed.
Not gone. Changed.
She didn't break. A pause. She adapted. Another. She's not what she was. And finally, she's evolving. Lyra stood still as the words spread, not reacting, not acknowledging, but hearing every single one, because now, for the first time since the night, she lost everything. They weren't looking at her with pity. They were watching her with caution. And somewhere, far beyond these walls, the Alpha King had not forgotten her. He was watching too, waiting. And when their paths crossed again, she would not be the one on her knees. The first move wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. And it wasn't meant to be seen. Because the most dangerous cracks don't start with impact. They start with pressure. The room was smaller than the great hall she once stood in. No towering pillars. No ceremonial gold. Just a long table. Maps spread across its surface. Ink markings layered over territories like quiet warnings. Lyra stood at the edge of it. Still. Focused. Across from her. Him. Watching. Not guiding. Waiting. You don't attack power directly, he said.
His voice calm.
Measured. You make it question itself. Lyra's gaze didn't lift from the map. And how do you do that? A slight pause. Without being seen? A faint shift in the air. By never being the source. Her fingers traced a line across the territories, stopping at a marked border. His alliances are strong. They're dependent. The correction came instantly. On him. A beat. And anything that depends on one point, Lyra finished it, quietly, can be broken at that point. Silence followed. Not empty. Confirming. They didn't aim for the throne. They aimed for the foundation. The allies. The agreements. The quiet understandings that held everything in place. Because if those shifted, even slightly, the king's power wouldn't fall. It would weaken. And weakness was enough. The first rumor wasn't even a rumor. It was a suggestion. A question asked in the right room.
To the right person.
At the right time. Strange, isn't it? A noblewoman's voice. Soft, thoughtful. How the Eastern Pact has gone quiet? A pause. Especially after the last tribute was delayed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing accusatory. Just enough to plant something. A seed. Lyra stood at the edge of the gathering. Listening. Not speaking. Not yet. Because this wasn't about her voice. It was about their doubt. Another room. Another conversation. Of course the king knows, someone insisted. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Does he? The words slipped in.
Soft.
Unassuming. The speaker paused. Just for a second. That's what I assumed. Lyra didn't smile. Assumptions can be dangerous. Then silence. And in that silence, something shifted. This time, information. Carefully placed. Never directly traced. A document. A message. A delayed response that didn't align. Not proof, but enough to question. And questioning was where everything began to unravel. Lyra didn't expose the king. She exposed the space around him. And in that space, doubt grew. The whispers changed. Not about her. About him. Have you noticed? He's been less present. The last agreement felt rushed. Small things. Insignificant on their own. But together.
Pattern.
And patterns made people uncomfortable. Because patterns suggested intention. Or worse. Loss of control. Lyra watched it happen. Quietly. Carefully. The way conversations lingered longer than they should. The way eyes shifted before answers came. The way confidence turned into hesitation.
Just slightly.
It wasn't collapse. Not yet. But it was movement. And movement could be guided. She felt it. The difference. Not in the room. In herself. Her hands didn't shake anymore. Her voice didn't falter. Her thoughts didn't scatter under pressure. Because now, she understood the game. And more importantly, she could play it. You're adjusting faster than expected. His voice came from behind her. Lyra didn't turn immediately. Expected by who? Everyone.
A beat.
Even me. That made her glance back.
Just briefly.
And now, a pause. Measured. You're becoming useful. The words should have stung. They didn't, because she understood what they meant now. Not dismissal. Recognition. The girl who had been rejected would have needed validation. The woman standing here
Didn't.
but power, even in its quiet form, never moved unnoticed for long, because somewhere, beyond the rooms and whispers and carefully placed out, there was a man who built his empire on control. And control. Noticed everything. The chamber was silent, not the kind of silence that came from peace. The kind that came from expectation. Waiting. A messenger stood at the center, head lowered, hands steady, but only just. Valdric Thornhall didn't speak immediately.
He read. Once.
Then again.
Slowly. Carefully.
As if the words might change the second time. They didn't. Say it. The command was quiet, but it didn't need to be louder. My king. The messenger swallowed. There have been questions. A pause. Regarding the Eastern Pact, Valdric's gaze didn't lift. And delays. Miscommunication. Uncertainty among the council. Uncertainty doesn't exist without cause. The interruption was immediate.
Sharp.
Find it. Yes, my king. The messenger hesitated. Just slightly. There is one more thing. That made him look up. Not quickly. Not dramatically. But deliberately. Speak. The messenger inhaled slowly. Some believe. A pause. This may be connected to external influence. Valdric's expression didn't change. Define external. The hesitation this time was longer. More dangerous. Unknown parties. Silence followed. Heavy. Because unknown was not something he tolerated. Then, another message was placed on the table.
Sealed.
Unfamiliar. Valdric's gaze shifted to it, studied it, then broke the seal. His eyes scanned the contents.
Once.
Then again.
Slower.
And for the first time, something changed. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But it was there. Recognition. Because the message didn't accuse. Didn't threaten.
Didn't explain.
It only said one thing. She survived. The room didn't move. Didn't breathe. Because they didn't understand what that meant. But he did. And as his fingers tightened slightly against the paper, as his gaze darkened just enough, one truth settled into place. Lyra Ashwin was no longer gone, and whatever she was becoming was already reaching him. Act 6. Escalation. Personal stakes 70:00, 85:00. When power stops being political and becomes personal. The night did not feel like night anymore. It felt heavier, like the air itself had been punished into silence. Somewhere beyond the safety of her hiding place, the kingdom was still awake, but not alive. Patrol fires flickered across distant towers, casting restless shadows that moved like they were searching for something they had already lost. Her. She stood near the edge of the chamber window, unmoving, her reflection fractured in the glass. Not broken.
Not yet.
But strained, like something inside her had been pulled too far for too long. Behind her, footsteps approached. Slow. Controlled. Careful. Don't tell me you're still pretending this ends without blood, a voice said. It was the mentor. Older. Weathered. A man who had once believed in diplomacy before he learned what kings did with mercy. She didn't turn. I'm not pretending, she replied quietly. I'm calculating.
A pause.
Then the mentor stepped beside her, following her gaze into the dark kingdom beyond the walls. That's what they all say right before they stop being human. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Because somewhere deep inside her chest, something already knew he might be right. And then, the silence shattered. A sudden, violent knock at the outer door. Not polite. Not ceremonial. A warning disguised as impact.
Bang. Bang.
Then stillness. The mentor's hand moved instantly to his blade. But she didn't move. Because she already felt it before anyone spoke. The shift in the air. The message arriving before the messenger. The door opened. A royal envoy stood there, soaked in sweat, breathing like he had run through fire instead of corridors. His eyes didn't search the room. They locked directly onto her. Only her. And when he spoke, his voice carried something worse than urgency.
Fear.
The king has issued a decree. The words landed slowly, like they were being dragged across broken stone. Then the envoy swallowed. And, condition. The mentor stepped forward. Say it. But she already knew. She already felt it forming. The envoy's voice dropped. He has taken someone from your past. A pause. A deliberate cruelty in the timing. Then, your family is in custody. The room didn't explode. It collapsed inward. Silence didn't fall, it crushed. Her breath stopped halfway between inhale and denial. No, she said softly. Not as rejection. As disbelief refusing to become reality. The envoy continued, voice shaking now. The king's message is direct. He unfolded a sealed parchment. Royal insignia. Burned edges. As if even the message had been afraid to exist. And then he read it aloud. Come back or they suffer. The words did not echo. They stayed. Like they had been carved into the room itself. Her fingers slowly curled into a fist. Not anger first.
Fear.
Not for herself.
For them.
A flicker of memory hit her. Hands that once held hers. Laughter that didn't ask for permission. A voice calling her name before she ever understood what power meant. And now, that same voice could be silenced. The mentor stepped closer, low and urgent. This is what he does. He doesn't win wars. He manufactures obedience. But she wasn't listening, because something else was happening inside her. Something dangerous. Something stabilizing. Fear was being replaced, not by courage, by clarity. She finally spoke, voice quiet enough to feel like it might break. If I go back, I die. A beat. If I stay, they suffer. The envoy lowered his eyes. Even delivering the message had cost him something. The mentor shook his head sharply. You are not the only variable in this kingdom. He wants you isolated. That's the strategy. But she turned now, slowly. And for the first time in this entire sequence, her eyes were not searching for answers. They had already found one. I understand the strategy, she said. A pause. Then, I just don't accept it. The room went still again, because something in her tone had changed. Not softer, not stronger. Final. The mentor stared at her. You're talking like someone who's already decided. She nodded once. I have. The envoy took a cautious step back, sensing something shifting that he was not meant to witness. Then what is your response? He asked carefully. She looked toward the window again. Toward the kingdom. Toward the throne that believed it owned outcomes. And when she spoke, her voice carried no hesitation. I go back. The mentor snapped instantly. That's exactly what he wants.
She didn't react.
I know. You'll be walking into a cage. I know. You'll be giving him leverage over everything you are. She finally turned fully toward him. And what he saw in her expression stopped him from speaking. Because there was no panic. No confusion. Only resolve sharpened into something almost surgical. I am already in a cage, she said softly. He just hasn't realized I've learned the shape of it. A silence. Then she stepped past him. The envoy moved aside instinctively. The mentor reached out. Wait. She stopped. Not turning back, but listening. His voice lowered. If you go back like this, you don't come back the same. A pause. Then, or at all. That landed deeper than any threat from the king. For a moment she said nothing. Then, maybe that's the point, and she walked out. The corridor outside felt longer than it should have. Like the kingdom itself was stretching to delay what was coming. Guards lined the path now, silent, rigid, watching her like history had already decided her ending. No one stopped her. No one dared. Because rumors move faster than orders in a frightened kingdom. And fear had already chosen a side. As she descended toward the transport gate, her mind replayed fragments. The message. The names implied but not spoken. The cost. Every step forward was a negotiation with consequence. Behind her, The mentor followed silently, not as authority anymore, as witness, as someone who understood that some decisions don't need approval, only survival. At the gate, the wind hit harder,
Cold.
open.
Exposed.
A waiting carriage stood ready, black insignia stamped into its frame like a warning. And there, waiting for her return, was the path back into the king's world. She paused. Just once. The mentor spoke quietly. One last chance to change direction. She didn't look at him. Instead, she whispered, "If I change direction now, I teach him this works." A beat. And I refuse to teach him anything else. She stepped into the carriage. The doors closed. A heavy latch clicked. And for a moment, there was only silence. Then the carriage began to move. Inside, the world narrowed.
Wood.
Steel.
Breath.
Her reflection in the dark window looked unfamiliar now. Not weaker, not stronger, just committed. The envelope with the king's message lay on the seat beside her. She didn't open it again. She didn't need to, because the message had already done its job. Pressure.
Fear. Control.
The tools of a ruler who believed love could be used as leverage. Outside, the kingdom passed in blurred fragments, lights, walls, shadows of people who did not yet know what had been set in motion. And then, a second message arrived, not physical, but delivered through silence. A distant horn sounded, one she recognized immediately. Royal signal. Emergency protocol. The king wasn't waiting anymore. He was escalating. The carriage jolted slightly as it changed speed. The escort had been upgraded. Military now. Not protection. Containment. She closed her eyes briefly. In that darkness, something crystallized. No more hesitation. No more negotiation with fear. When she opened her eyes again, they were steady, cold, focused. And then she spoke aloud, not to anyone in the carriage, but to the world waiting ahead. If he thinks this is leverage, a slow inhale, he's about to learn what pressure creates. She leaned forward slightly, fingers tightening, and when I arrive, a pause that stretched like a drawn blade. We don't negotiate anymore. Her gaze sharpened. We take everything from him, publicly. Outside, the wheels of the carriage rolled faster. And somewhere far ahead in the kingdom's heart, a king waited, believing he still controlled the outcome, not knowing yet that escalation had already changed ownership of the game. Act 7. The summit build-up. 85:00, 100:00. When power gathers in one place and control begins to fracture. The summons was not subtle. It was never meant to be. The summit grounds stretched across the ancient borderlands where no single pack could claim dominion without consequence. Stone pillars rose like forgotten bones of old treaties, and beneath them, history itself seemed to breathe, uneasy and waiting. This was not peace. It was containment dressed as diplomacy. And today, every pack had arrived. Flags from rival territories snapped violently in the wind, each one a reminder that unity here was temporary at best and illusion at worst. Above the gathering, the sky felt too still, like even the heavens were waiting to see who would survive, what came next. Inside the preparation chambers, silence was no longer absence, it was pressure. She stood at the center of it, not being dressed, being prepared. Attendants moved around her like shadows afraid to linger too long in her presence. Fabric was adjusted, metal was fastened. Symbols of rank and recognition were placed upon her with careful reverence, as if any mistake might provoke something irreversible. But she did not move like someone being adorned. She moved like someone being forged. A voice broke the silence. Hold still. It was not an order. It was respect disguised as authority. She complied, but only just. Her gaze remained forward, unfocused on the hands working around her, focused instead on something no one else in the room could see. Distance.
Time.
The shape of what was coming. Behind her, the mentor observed quietly. He had seen warriors prepared for war. He had never seen one prepared for judgment. You realize what they're doing out there, he said lowly. They're not just gathering leaders. They're staging pressure. She responded without turning. They always do. A pause. Then she added, "This time, I'm not the one they're pressuring." Something in her voice had changed. Not louder. Not colder.
Certain.
The doors opened, and the room shifted, because presence has weight, and hers entered before she did. For a moment, even the attendants stopped moving. Not out of command. Out of instinct. She stepped forward. Now fully prepared. Not decorated. Defined. Her presence was no longer the story of what she had survived. It was the warning of what she had become. The chamber mirrored her transformation in fragments, reflections on polished stone, flickers of metal, eyes that struggled to settle on a single interpretation. Some saw strength. Some saw danger. Most could not decide which one frightened them more. The mentor followed at a distance, but even he no longer walked beside her. He walked after her, as if the space between them had become symbolic. A boundary of what could still be influenced and what could no longer be contained. The summit hall loomed ahead. Massive doors carved from ancient treaty stones stood sealed, engraved with symbols representing every pack in attendance. Unity carved into architecture. Division waiting beneath it. A guard stepped forward, then stopped. Not because he was ordered, because he looked at her and forgot why he had stepped forward at all. Finally, he opened the doors. The hall erupted into presence. Dozens of leaders. Hundreds of warriors. Ancient alliances and fresh rivalries seated across a vast circular chamber designed to force acknowledgement of equality that did not exist. Every eye shifted the moment she entered. Not gradually. Instantly. Like gravity had changed direction. Whispers began, but they were not about identity. They were about change. Because what walked into the summit was not what had left the kingdom. It was something revised, rewritten, refined under pressure no one here had witnessed. And then, the king saw her. He did not rise immediately. At first, his expression remained controlled, measuring, calculating, as if trying to locate the version of her he expected, the version he believed he still understood. But the longer he looked, the more that certainty collapsed. A flicker crossed his eyes. Then another. Shock. Not loud. Not expressive.
Contained.
But unmistakable. She did not stop walking. She moved into the chamber like she belonged to no seat, no faction, no permission. And for the first time, the room adjusted to her position instead of assigning it. The king's jaw tightened. A subtle shift. Possession attempting to reassert itself. "You came," he said finally. The words carried familiarity. Ownership disguised as recognition.
She stopped.
Not in front of him. Not beneath him. But at distance. Equalized. Her voice, when it came, was calm. "I was invited." A pause. The king's gaze sharpened. "That is not what I meant." A ripple moved through the chamber. Everyone felt it now. Not politics. Not diplomacy. Something older. Something personal. The mentor's hand tightened subtly at the edge of the room. He understood what was forming. Not negotiation. Collision. The king stepped forward slightly. His voice lowered. "This is not the version of you I allowed to leave." Silence fell instantly. The words were not subtle. They were revealing. And dangerous. Because they implied memory. Control. History rewritten in entitlement. She tilted her head slightly. A quiet study. Then, "That's the problem," she said softly. "You still think you allowed anything." A pause. The chamber tightened. Leaders leaned forward unconsciously. Warriors shifted. Something invisible had just cracked open. The king's expression changed. The shock now deepening into something sharper.
Rage.
But underneath it, uncertainty. Because she was not reacting like someone returning under pressure. She was reacting like someone arriving with intention. And then it happened. The shift. Not spoken. Not declared. But felt across the entire hall. Power alignment breaking. The king noticed it first. His authority, once effortless in this space, no longer anchored reactions the way it used to. Eyes were no longer exclusively on him. They were divided. Not because she demanded attention, but because she carried weight without permission. His voice darkened. "What did they do to you?" A dangerous question, because it assumed transformation required interference. She stepped slightly forward, just enough to close the emotional distance. Not physical dominance. Psychological proximity. I stopped waiting for permission, she said. A beat. That's all. The king's hand curled faintly at his side. Possessiveness surfacing, not as affection, as refusal to lose narrative control. But before he could respond, the atmosphere changed again.
Subtly.
Almost imperceptibly. The room itself began to listen differently. Leaders exchanged glances. Even rival factions felt it. Something was happening beneath dialogue. A recalibration of power perception. And the most dangerous realization of all began to spread silently. The king was no longer the center of certainty. He noticed it too. And for the first time, rage and insecurity collided in his expression. His voice dropped. You think this is yours now? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the hall. At every leader watching. At every faction calculating. At every alliance waiting to see where fear would land. Then she returned her gaze to him and said, I don't think. A pause. I act. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded, like the entire summit had inhaled without permission. The king stepped forward again, faster this time, intensity rising. But something had already shifted too far for speed to reclaim, because as he moved, so did the room's attention, following her, not him, and, in that fraction of imbalance, the foundation of control fractured. A leader from the northern packs leaned slightly forward, whispering to another. A warrior's subtly adjusted stance, not toward the king, but toward her. The king saw it, all of it, and his expression finally broke. Not fully, but enough. Enough for the truth to surface. He was no longer controlling perception. He was reacting to it. And she was no longer an arrival. She was an axis. The mentor closed his eyes briefly at the edge of the hall. He understood now. This was not confrontation. This was transition. And transitions always feel like collapse to those who lose control of them. The king's voice sharpened, dangerously low. This ends here. She looked at him one final time, and her expression carried something that made the room still further. Not anger, not fear, but inevitability. No, she said softly. This is where it begins. The air tightened. Every faction, every leader, every warrior, all of them felt it at the same time. The summit was no longer balanced, not even close. And in that shared realization, no one moved, no one spoke, because everyone in the room understood the same terrifying truth at once. Whatever happened next would not stay contained. And the king was no longer the only one they were watching. Act 8. Final Confrontation, Climax, 100:00, 120:00. When truth is no longer hidden, and power finally has to answer for itself. The summit hall did not feel like a chamber anymore. It felt like a sealed verdict waiting for execution. Every breath inside it carried weight now, because nothing said here would remain contained. Not speeches. Not lies. Not power. This was no longer diplomacy. It was exposure. And everyone in the room knew it, even those pretending not to. The king stood at the center dais. But something had changed in his posture. Subtle at first. A tension in the shoulders that had not been there before. A recalibration. Because for the first time in his rule, he was not controlling the room's attention. He was holding it together. Barely. Across from him, she stood still. Not elevated. Not lowered. Positioned in a way that refused hierarchy entirely. And that alone was already destabilizing everything. The mentor watched from the edge of the hall, silent now. Because this was no longer something to guide. It was something to witness. A slow shift began. Not dramatic. Not announced. But unmistakable. Attendants near the outer circle began exchanging sealed documents. Leaders who had arrived with loyalty now studied them with hesitation. Whispers formed and died instantly, like even sound was afraid of being recorded in memory. And then, the first fracture appeared. A senior envoy stepped forward from the Eastern faction. Then another. And another. Each holding something. Proof. Records. Transactions. Orders. Things that had been buried under power for too long to remain invisible any longer. The king noticed. His eyes narrowed sharply. What is this? But no one answered him. Not immediately. Because attention had already shifted. Not toward him. Toward her. She stepped forward once. That was all. No theatrics. No ceremony. Just movement that made the entire hall instinctively quiet down further. And when she spoke, the room did not interrupt. Not even the king. I didn't come here to negotiate, she said. A pause. I came here to finish what you started the moment you decided truth was optional. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not disagreement. Recognition. The king's expression tightened. You think you understand politics now? Her gaze lifted slightly, meeting his fully. I don't need to understand what I've survived. Silence. And then, she turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the room, expanding the audience. Because this was no longer a conversation between two people. It was collective reckoning. I was told I was a liability, she said calmly. A pause. I was told I was unstable. Another beat. I was told I was replaceable. Her voice did not rise. It sharpened. And every one of those decisions was made in rooms like this. A document was lifted from the Eastern envoy's hands. Then another. Then another. Evidence. Contracts. Secret directives. Manipulated succession records. Hidden punishment orders. And the room began to change. Not emotionally. Structurally. Because truth, once introduced at scale, stops being information and becomes environment. The king's hand tightened on the edge of the dais. Enough. The word came out louder than intended. A reflex. A correction attempt. But it was already too late. She turned back to him, slowly. And what she said next did not echo. It landed. You built your authority on silence. A pause. I built mine on surviving it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recalculating minds. Because leaders were no longer watching a king versus a rebel. They were watching exposure versus control. And control was losing precision. The king stepped forward. For the first time, urgency breaking his composure. This is orchestrated, he said sharply. She's manipulating perception. But even as he spoke, he noticed something worse. No one immediately agreed. No one immediately defended him. That pause, that hesitation, was louder than accusation. And it hit him. Hard. His voice dropped slightly. Tell them, he said, turning toward her now. Tell them what you are doing. A challenge. A demand. A return to controllable narrative. But she did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him like someone studying a system that had finally revealed its final flaw. And then, she spoke. I am not doing anything. A pause. I am showing you what you already built. A ripple moved again. This time stronger. Because truth does not need volume when it has alignment. The king's breathing shifted. Faster now. Less controlled. He looked around the room. And saw it. Not rebellion. Not uprising. Worse. Reinterpretation. People were no longer seeing him as unquestionable. They were seeing him as explainable. And explainable power is already halfway to collapse. Then it happened. A shift so subtle, it almost went unnoticed. A faction leader lowered their gaze. Not in submission, but in reconsideration. Then another. Then another. Until the entire hall was no longer unified in perception. It was divided into before and after. The king's voice sharpened. You think this changes anything? But even as he said it, it already had. She stepped forward again. One step. Enough to bring silence back into focus. And then, she said it. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just clearly enough to end ambiguity. You didn't lose me. A pause. A breath held across the hall. You threw me away. The sentence did not explode. It emptied the room. Because it removed all remaining justification. All remaining distortion. all remaining narrative safety. The king froze. For the first time, not responding, not calculating, just exposed. And then, something in him broke. Not physically, not visibly at first, but internally, because he stepped forward again, but slower now, uncertain. His voice lowered, for the first time not commanding, but asking. Stay. A pause. The hall tightened. Even allies who once followed him instinctively did not interrupt. He swallowed. I was wrong. Silence. Absolute. Not respectful. Judging. And in that silence, the power structure inverted. Not announced. Not declared. Recognized. She looked at him. And for a moment, no one in the hall could predict what would happen next. Not even the king. Because she now stood where he once stood. Not beneath authority. Not beside it. Outside it entirely. And that position cannot be negotiated with. Only answered. She spoke finally. And her voice carried no hesitation.
No.
A pause. You don't get to ask me to stay.
A breath.
You already decided I didn't matter. The king's expression tightened again, but this time there was nothing left behind it to stabilize the collapse. Around the hall, no one moved. No one intervened. No one defended. Because authority without consensus is just memory waiting to expire. And then, the final silence arrived.
Heavy. Complete.
Judgment without words. The king stood still. Not defeated yet, but no longer standing alone in certainty. And she remained facing him, unshaken, unclaimed, unreturnable. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood the same truth at once. The confrontation was not about who would win. It was about who would remain when belief finally finished collapsing. And the answer was no longer his to decide. Act 9, Resolution 120:00, 130:00. When power finally falls, it doesn't always make a sound. Sometimes, it just stops being obeyed. The silence after the confrontation did not end. It simply expanded, like the summit hall had inhaled a truth too large to process, and now couldn't decide how to release it. No one spoke, not because they were ordered to remain quiet, but because speech suddenly felt unnecessary in a world where certainty had already been rewritten. The king still stood at the center dais. But something fundamental had changed in the way the room held him. It was not hatred, not rebellion. It was absence of reinforcement. The invisible structure that had once elevated him, loyalty, fear, assumption, tradition, had stopped responding. And without it, he was just a man in a room full of witnesses. His gaze shifted slowly across the chamber, looking for something, a reaction, a signal, a return to familiarity. But what he found instead was distance. Leaders who once deferred now looked away. Allies who once stood closest now stood still farther back, as if proximity itself had become reputational risk. And in that widening silence, his authority began to thin. Not collapse.
Not yet.
Just withdraw. Like something losing permission to exist. She remained where she stood. Not advancing. Not retreating. Just present. And that presence alone was now shaping the room more than any decree ever had. A faction leader lowered their insignia. Then another followed. No announcement. No protest. Just action. Quiet reclassification of allegiance. One by one. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Inevitable. The system was no longer resisting her. It was recalibrating around her absence of fear. The mentor watched from the far edge of the hall. He had seen revolutions before, but this was not one. This was erosion. Controlled.
Precise.
Psychological. The kind that doesn't destroy structures. It simply removes belief from them. The king finally spoke, but his voice no longer carried the architecture of command. It was stripped of echo. Stripped of reach. I still hold authority, he said. The sentence sounded different even to him as he said it, like something rehearsed too long past its expiration. No one answered immediately. That delay, that single moment of unanswered claim, was louder than denial, A leader in the outer circle adjusted their stance, not toward the king. Away from him. Another did the same. Then another. And suddenly, the shift was no longer subtle. It was visible, not rebellion.
Departure.
The king noticed it. His expression tightened. Something inside him tried to reassert control. "This is temporary," he said more firmly. "You are reacting emotionally." But even as he said it, his eyes betrayed him, because he could see it now. The room was no longer waiting for instruction. It was waiting for confirmation that instruction no longer mattered. She stepped slightly forward, not toward him, but into the space where authority used to land, and spoke calmly. "There's nothing emotional about recognition."
A pause.
"I didn't take anything from you." Another beat. "You lost at the moment people stopped needing you to explain their fear." That sentence did not provoke outrage. It produced stillness. Deeper stillness. Because everyone understood it, even those who would never admit it aloud. The king's hands tightened at his sides. A final attempt at composure. But it was already fragmented. His voice lowered. "You think they will follow you?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked across the hall. At the leaders. The factions. The witnesses. Not as subjects. Not as enemies. But as people standing at the edge of a system that no longer described them accurately. Then she spoke. "I don't need them to follow me."
A pause.
"I just needed them to stop pretending they don't see." And that was the final fracture point. Because pretending is what holds systems together longer than belief ever does. The king turned slightly, looking now not at her, but at the room itself, as if realizing too late that authority is not held by position. It is held by participation. And participation had just stopped being guaranteed. A silence stretched. Longer this time. He exhaled slowly. And something in that breath felt like exhaustion finally overtaking denial. Around him, movement began again. But not in his direction.
Away.
One by one, leaders rose. Not dramatically. Not in protest. Simply leaving the structure of attention that had once centered him. A withdrawal of validation, so complete it required no confrontation. Just absence. And absence, repeated enough times, becomes truth. The king stood still. Now isolated in the most dangerous way power can experience isolation. Not surrounded by enemies, but by people who no longer needed him to exist in the same role. He looked at her one last time. But even that gaze lacked leverage now, because it was no longer anchored in authority, only memory. And memory does not command action. It only explains what no longer continues. She did not move toward him. She did not pursue. She did not assert victory through spectacle. Instead, she simply stood in the space where change had finished arriving. And for the first time since this began, there was no tension in her posture. Not triumph. Not aggression. Just closure forming quietly under the surface of everything. The hall continued to empty in controlled silence. A system dissolving without collapse. A hierarchy ending without resistance. The mentor finally stepped forward slightly. Not to her. Not to the king. But to the moment itself. Because even he understood. This was no longer an event. It was aftermath beginning in real time. The king remained alone at the center dais. Not defeated in spectacle, but emptied of function. And that, more than any battle, was irreversible. She turned slightly, just enough to begin to leave. And as she did, there was no look back. No final exchange. No lingering attachment to resolution. Only movement forward.
Slow.
Measured.
Certain.
And in that departure, there was no celebration. No declaration. No emotional excess. Only something quieter. Heavier. Final. Because power had not been taken. It had simply stopped being recognized. And the moment recognition ends, what remains is not victory. It is clarity. And she walked out of the hall carrying exactly that. Not as triumph, but as truth finally allowed to exist without resistance. Act 10. Emotional closure. 130:00, 140:00. When the battle ends, what remains is not power, but identity rebuilt in silence. The world outside the summit hall did not feel changed immediately. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that announced itself with celebration or chaos. Instead, it felt recalibrated, as if reality itself was still adjusting to a decision that had already been made inside it. The corridors beyond the hall were quieter now. Not empty, just no longer performing tension. And she walked through them slowly. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Just present in a space that no longer demanded she prove she belonged inside it. Behind her, footsteps approached. Measured. Familiar in rhythm, but no longer defined by opposition. She did not stop. She already knew who it was. The rival Alpha. Once an adversary shaped by instinct, pride, and inherited conflict. Now something else entirely. Not softened. Not diminished. Repositioned. He walked beside her, not ahead, not behind. Matching pace. But not claiming it. There was silence between them for several steps. Not uncomfortable. Just unfinished. Then finally, "I didn't expect it to end like that," he said. His voice carried less resistance now. More observation. More reflection. She didn't look at him immediately. "I didn't either," she replied. A pause. Then, "That's usually how things end when people stop pretending they're permanent." The words hung between them, not as philosophy, as aftermath. They exited into the outer air. The sky above the summit grounds had shifted slightly. Clouds breaking apart in uneven light. Not peaceful, but no longer oppressive. A world no longer held in a single narrative. The Alpha slowed slightly, then spoke again. "You didn't just break him," he said carefully. "You removed the structure around him." She exhaled softly. Not agreement. Not correction. Acknowledgement. They walked further. The distance between them no longer defined by rivalry, but by transition. From opposition to understanding. And slowly, understanding began to settle into something more stable. At the edge of the grounds, they stopped. Not because they had to, but because movement itself now required intention again. The Alpha looked at her. Not evaluating. Not challenging.
Just seeing.
For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, "I was trained to believe you were the problem," he admitted. A pause. "And I never questioned what that meant." Silence followed. Not heavy.
Honest.
She turned slightly toward him now. Not fully. Just enough. "Most people don't question what protects their place in the system," she said quietly. Another pause. Then she added, "Even if it costs them their truth." The Alpha nodded slowly. Something in him shifting, not dramatically, but irreversibly. "I don't want to operate like that anymore," he said. The admission was simple, but it carried weight. Because simplicity is what truth sounds like when it stops resisting itself. She studied him for a moment, not judging, not accepting, just recognizing change when it was still fragile. The wind moved gently between them, no longer carrying urgency, only direction. He spoke again, softer now. "What are you going to do now?" The question was not strategic. It was human. She looked out toward the horizon, not as destination, but as absence of constraint. A long silence followed, not empty, forming. And then, "I don't know everything yet," she said. A pause. "But I know what I am not anymore." The Alpha watched her closely, waiting, and then she turned slightly more fully toward him, not to declare, but to define. "I am not what he said I was." The words landed softly, but they did not need force. Because they were no longer resisting anything. They were simply replacing an old definition with something that finally fit. A quiet breath passed between them, and something shifted again. Not between them as individuals, but between identities that no longer needed conflict to validate existence. The Alpha stepped slightly closer, not invading space, but acknowledging proximity. "I can't undo what I was part of," he said. She nodded once. "I don't expect you to." A pause. Then she added, "But what you choose next still matters." The words were not judgment. They were invitation without obligation. And that distinction mattered more than anything that had come before. Because power had already been rewritten. Now responsibility was being redistributed. Quietly, individually, irreversibly, they stood there for a moment longer, not as enemies, not as allies defined by necessity, but as two people no longer bound by the same illusion of fixed identity. The Alpha exhaled slowly, then spoke, almost under his breath. "I don't think I ever really knew you," she responded without hesitation. "You knew what you were told." A pause. "And I believed what I was told about myself too." Silence followed, not heavy, liberating in its recognition. The wind shifted again, softer now, less resistance in it. She turned forward again, ready to leave, not escaping anything, just moving into a space no longer defined by opposition. But before she stepped away completely,
She paused.
not dramatically, just enough for the moment to become intentional. And then she said, "I used to think being rejected meant I was less." A pause, her voice steady, "But I wasn't less." Another breath. "I was just defined by someone who needed me to be." The Alpha didn't respond. He didn't need to, because the truth was no longer directional. It was shared understanding. And in that shared silence, something finally settled. Not victory, not closure imposed, but identity reclaimed. She began to walk forward, not away from anyone, just toward what came after language built on control. The Alpha remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching, not holding, not chasing, just witnessing transformation without ownership. And then, quietly, he followed at a distance, not as follower, not as leader, but as someone no longer willing to disappear into old definitions. And as she moved further into the horizon, there was no final declaration, no applause, no concluding triumph, only the sound of a world no longer arguing with her existence. And in that stillness, she finally understood something that no confrontation had been able to teach her before. She was never what he said she was. She never had been. And now, she didn't have to be anything but what remained when the noise finally stopped. Act 11, Epilogue 140:00, End. When the story ends, the world doesn't stop. It just learns to live under a new truth. The land did not look different at first glance. The same horizon lines, the same shifting winds across the open territories, the same ancient earth that had seen kingdoms rise, fracture, and forget themselves. But something underneath it all had changed, not visibly, structurally, like the world had quietly adjusted its weight after realizing it was no longer being held in place by fear. She stood alone at the edge of a rising valley, not hidden, not guarded, not positioned as a symbol, just present. The wind moved through the tall grass around her, bending it in slow waves that felt almost deliberate, as if the land itself was learning a new rhythm. Behind her, the beginnings of something new were forming. Not a kingdom, not an empire, not a structure built on obedience. A sanctuary. It had started small. A refusal to return to old systems. A decision not to inherit broken hierarchies just because they were familiar. And then, quietly, others began to arrive. Not summoned, not commanded.
Drawn.
Those who no longer fit inside the remnants of collapsing power structures. Those who had survived control but not belonged to it. Those who had begun to question what they were protecting and who they were protecting it for. And she did not give them a throne. She gave them space. Wood was gathered. Stone was placed. Boundaries were drawn not to exclude, but to protect what was fragile enough to grow without pressure. There were no banners declaring dominance. No insignias marking ownership. Only shared work, shared silence, shared rebuilding. And slowly, something unfamiliar took shape. Not order imposed from above, but stability emerging from within. She walked through it now, not as ruler, not as outsider, not as someone defined by opposition, but as something more dangerous to old systems than all of those combined. A builder who no longer needed permission. A presence that did not require validation to exist. People moved around her naturally, not with fear, not with worship, but with recognition, not of status, of trust earned through absence of control. A young voice called out from across the settlement. Is this going to be like before? The question was not loud, but it carried weight. She stopped walking,
Turned slightly.
met the question fully, and for a moment, there was silence. Not hesitation. Careful honesty. Then she replied.
No.
A pause. Then she added, because nothing here is built on forcing people to stay. The answer did not create relief instantly. It created understanding slowly, and that was stronger. Later, near the center of the sanctuary, she stood with those who had chosen to remain closest, not because they were closest in rank, but because they had chosen proximity without obligation. The Alpha was there too, not as rival, not as shadow of conflict, but as presence that no longer needed definition through opposition. He looked at the structure forming around them, then at her. You really built something different, he said quietly. She didn't look away from the horizon. I stopped trying to fix what only survived through control, she replied. A pause. And started building what doesn't need it. The words settled between them, not as philosophy, as reality being constructed in real time. The sanctuary grew slowly, not in size alone, but in clarity. People learned not just how to live inside it, but how to exist without constant evaluation, without fear shaping every decision, without silence being mistaken for safety. And in that environment, something subtle but profound began to happen. People stayed, not because they were held, but because they were no longer running. One evening, as light softened across the valley, she stood alone again, not isolated, just reflective. The sky above was shifting into warm tones, gold dissolving into quiet blue. The kind of sky that doesn't announce endings, only transitions. Behind her, the sanctuary moved with quiet life. Not perfect, not finished, but alive in a way she had never seen systems allow before. A voice approached gently from behind. The Alpha. He stopped beside her. Didn't speak immediately.
Neither did she.
They both watched the horizon, as if waiting for something that no longer needed to arrive. Finally, he said, You never went back to who you were before. She answered softly. I couldn't. A pause. Then, I didn't survive all that just to return to it. Silence followed. Not heavy. Settled. The wind moved through the valley again. And this time, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like continuation. Like the world no longer pushing against her existence, but moving alongside it. The Alpha spoke one last time. So, what are you now? The question wasn't demand. It was recognition of something still becoming. She thought for a moment, not searching for an identity that fit old language, but listening for one that already existed without needing permission. Then she said, I'm not what they decided. A pause. I'm what remains when they no longer get to decide. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before. It was not tension, not judgment, not anticipation. It was acceptance. And in that acceptance, there was peace. Not fragile peace, not conditional peace, but peace built on absence of control. The final image was not of power, not of dominance, not of victory. It was of presence. Her standing at the edge of a living sanctuary, not elevated, not isolated, but included in something that no longer required her to be anything other than herself. The wind moved through the valley. The people continued building behind her, and the horizon stretched forward without resistance. No throne, no chains, no audience demanding a version of her shaped by fear. Only life, chosen, willing,
Real.
and as the light faded into evening, there was no final declaration, no ending speech, no imposed conclusion, only a quiet truth settling into the world like it had always belonged there. Power was no longer what controlled her story. It was what she had finally learned to walk away from. And in that choice, she became whole.